now move on to our first panel discussion of the day, titled Creating the Right Policy Framework. In this session, the panelists will discuss the gaps that are still in the proposed Digital India Act and will try to address them on stage. For this session, we would like to invite Shaurya Doval, Member, Board of Governors, India Foundation and MD, Torch Investments; Nikhil Pahwa, Founder, MediaNama; Apar Gupta, Director, Internet Freedom Foundation. And to moderate this session, we have Kazim Rizvi, Founding Director, The Dialogue. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guests up on the stage.
Thank you so much, Financial Express, for organizing this and for calling us here. It's an absolute pleasure to be amongst a distinguished set of panelists, Mr. Doval, Apar, and Nikhil, and I don't think any of them need any introduction. It's great to sort of look at all of you. It's a full house, so look forward to a very riveting discussion. I've been told I have 30 minutes due to certain delays which took place in the last hour and a half. So we'll try to make it concise, crisp, and what we'll do is we'll start with a round of discussion. I have shared a few questions. I'll sort of focus that on the panelists themselves. We'll have a couple of round of Q&A between the moderator and the panelist. And then we'll open the floor to the audience for a few questions as well. So we look forward to that. But thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. And as you know, the topic is around the new Digital India Bill, which is being discussed. There were 2 consultations which took place in Bombay and Bangalore, and hopefully there will be a draft out very soon. But the idea for today is to sort of look at what are the principles we need for the new IT Act. The previous IT Act was passed in 2000, so which was 23 years ago. It was passed for a very different internet era where we did not see the active participation of communities, people, and different societies on social media, the use of internet for various services, the digitization of services as well, from payments to e-commerce to education, etc. So we need a new law to deal with some of the new emerging harms which have been taking place on the internet in the recent years. Honorable Minister has spoken about it in his presentation, and this has been discussed very often in the public discourse in India as well. And to start off the discussion, I would like to invite Mr. Shaurya Doval. Mr. Doval, I'd like to sort of begin with you. And you know, there's something which we're discussing, is the fact that we need a new law, we need a new IT Act which revisit some of the principles. We need to sort of look at the harms, and there are a lot of harms like fake news, misinformation, disinformation, which is going on the internet. And in general, the internet as a ecosystem, there have been a lot of abuse and exploitation which has been taking place, right? So what in your mind is a law which effectively regulates the internet intermediaries in India, the ecosystem in India? It ensures that the companies are accountable. It ensures that people feel protected. And in the long term, what are the ways that we can make a law which allows for greater growth of the Indian internet economy? So over to you, sir.
Thank you. It's interesting because I think before I specifically answer your question, you did allude to that, and the Honorable Minister also spoke. We just have to keep the context in mind. The last time we had the IT Act was in 2000, when the number of Indians using the internet was 5 million. Today we have got 850 million Indians on the internet and going up to 1.3 billion. So obviously it's clear that we need a completely different framework under which the law should be formulated. And I think that's exactly what the new law proposes to address. It must be a law that obviously today everybody is going to be on internet. They have a digital identity. So it must protect the citizen who's on the platform. It must be open and transparent. It must be future ready. It must be able to evolve with changing times, because this is such a dynamic thing that every day you've got new technologies coming in and new features coming in. So I think when I look at the new law, and the question that you asked was so broad-based, that I think essentially what we have to be looking at is a law that is enshrined in obviously the same fundamental principles under which our constitution is there, which the rest of the laws in this country is, which is protection of the citizen, openness and transparency, protection of liberties, with the added complexity that we are now operating in a very complex digital system. So how does it, which is very dynamic, much more dynamic than anything historically has been. So is it able to quickly respond to the changes that there are in, to be able to address those fundamental issues?
So I think broadly what you're trying to allude is finding the right balance between regulating the complexity of the internet while at the same time protecting the rights of the users and constitutional principles. I think that's a very interesting point, and I think a good segue to sort of Apar, I would like you to come in. And I think Mr. Doval sort of alluded to the fact that, we have to ensure that the constitutional principles are protected, the rights of the people are protected, while internet is a very complicated ecosystem as we see it today. Now, particularly on this point, I wanted to get your sort of sense on safe harbor provision, right, in terms of how and what should be the future of safe harbor if we are to revisit safe harbor, right? Why is it important in the current context? And what do you think with respect to just making sure that you find that balance between security and speech? So over to you.
Thanks for that question, Kazim. And before I come to it, and I will answer that, I'd like to commend Shaurya for two things. One is that he's recognized the scale of digital transformation, which is very, very deep. And second is adherence of any policy framework which goes towards a legislation emerging from our constitutional values, our preambular values. And I think here what's very important for us to understand is that the Digital India Act is not an act of legislature. It's at present not even a white paper. So we do not know what is in it. We have been hearing about it since 2022, and it emerges every time there is a high amount of scrutiny as to a vacuum in a legal framework to address a social need or an individual injury that is from the interface of technology. So the Digital India Bill is essentially promised as a panacea for all the tech harms which are today plaguing us. Now, given the scale of the digital transformation, I would propose what is needed today is not a Digital India Bill, but a Digital India Code. Our aspirations need to be much wider. For instance, when the Industrial Revolution took place, you saw a whole range of laws which came place to cater to environmental impacts, labor regulations, even for industrial boilers, right? So you need a much more broader sense of assessment around various aspects of human activity, as well as social impacts, and you may need multiple laws gauging market failure as well as constitutional requirements rather than one law which is an incoherent articulation to fix everything. At present, I would like to indicate that this is being proceeded with in a manner which seems to be ad hoc, lacks seriousness, and does not emerge from policy frameworks under which the Information Technology Act was made in 2000, for instance, an interministerial committee in which multiple ministries of the union government collaborate to articulate how should technology touch upon their areas of work. Now, coming to the question which Kazim has prompted me, firstly, we must understand what is a safe harbor. A safe harbor essentially is at present contained under Section 79 of the Information Technology Act. It provides a legal immunity to conduits or intermediaries which essentially help facilitate exchanges of information on digital networks. It may be your internet service provider or it may be a big tech platform such as Google, right? So essentially, the controversy which has emerged, not only in India, but globally has been that the safe harbor protection by itself has immunized big tech platforms which in effect have become unaccountable. This has given rise to a large amount of criticism as well as efforts not only in India, but also in the United States in diluting these protections. However, most experts, if we look at it, who are independent, unaffiliated, and not even funded by these big tech platforms and do ask it for accountability, say that these protections actually are not there for the platforms. They are actually there for the end users who essentially utilize these services. They say that differentiation and gradation in providing safe harbor protections by itself looks at regulating speech rather than the business practices and the underlying surveillance capitalism models. I think we can take some learning here that the harms which do emerge from platforms can be regulated in manners rather than just increasing government control over platforms on areas of speech to much more economic aspects, requiring higher amounts of transparency, bringing in regulations to prevent self-preferencing and gatekeeper power, and some of these interventions are being piloted in the European Union. My final thing on this comment is that we need to think broader, we need to have our vision a little much more higher, on a higher pedestal to match the scale of digital transformation that is occurring in India today.
Thank you, Apar. Nikhil, I'd like to come to you on safe harbor, and we'll look at AI and entrepreneurship and startups as well, but just specifically a little bit on this question. And I want to look at 2 points here. Number one, in the last version of the amendments of the IT rules, there were a lot more additional due diligence requirements which were placed on the intermediaries to avail safe harbor, right? So number one, functionality-wise, does it really function in terms of additional due diligence obligations? Number two, if you look at globally, we look at the EU's Digital Services Act, or you look at the Online Safety Bill, countries are looking at placing additional due diligence norms on intermediaries to avail safe harbor. And this is not a unique concept to India, it's happening globally as well. So in light of what's happening globally, in light of what has already been passed under the IT Rules 2021, what would you think, or what is your suggestion for safe harbor, or if you're revisiting the idea itself, how should we code it into the new law? And subsequently, happy to also hear from you on the AI part as well. So over to you.
Thanks, Kazim. So I actually don't care about what's happening across the globe when it comes to safe harbor. I think we should have regulations that fit us in India and that are good for Indian citizens, Indian entrepreneurs, and that should be our focus. Just to explain safe harbor, right? If I say something illegal on the stage over here, should the Lalit be held liable for it? Should Financial Express be held liable for it, right? Safe harbor effectively would protect them from what I would say over here or what any of us would say here. So the Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar over the last few months has been repeatedly asking, do we really need safe harbor? So think about all the tools that we use. We message each other, we post on social media, we put videos out on YouTube or on Instagram. None of those platforms would survive that liability for user-generated content, right? So to answer the minister's question on do we really need safe harbor, of course we do. The internet will not survive without safe harbor. And yes, there are challenges that we see in terms of hateful content, doxing, some of the things that he mentioned in his comments earlier. And we need to have, norms, rules, regulations, and those exist as well to protect citizens against those harms. It's just that our implementation is poor, our policing is not effective enough. And so what we're trying to do is trying to address the inadequacies of the state machinery to act on these issues by trying to get platforms to police us more. So what you're seeing is a transference of power taking place, first from the citizens to the platform, because platforms were regulating us. And now what's happening is the state is defining what norms the platform should use to regulate us and our speech. So while we want protection of fundamental rights and constitutional rights, but the fact is there's also lack of transparency in that process. So for example, the minister spoke about the Twitter issues and the recent controversy around what Jack Dorsey said. Go back to 2020. The allegation against the government at that point in time was that it was legitimate speech of journalists that was also being censored by the government through an order given to Twitter. So where is protection of fundamental rights coming in over there? So I think when you look at these issues, we need transparency and accountability from the government as much as we need it from platforms. Unfortunately, what we're seeing, just like in the data protection bill, and the minister didn't mention this even though he was asked about it, there is actually exemption for government agencies so far in the drafts that we've seen, in many of these drafts, right? So government is exempt from accountability and transparency, but you want trust and accountability from companies and platforms and citizens all the time. And so there's a transference of power that's taking place. The other thing, that I wanted to talk about when it comes to the IT rules and what you're going to see with the Digital India Act is that there's probably going to be legitimization of rules that are currently illegal. So if you look at some of the aspects of the IT rules, for example, regulating digital news platforms, there's nothing in the IT Act that really enables that aspect. When you look at regulation of streaming services, which has now been handed over to MIB, the IT Act doesn't really allow for that. When you look at the attack on privacy in the IT rules with the attack on end-to-end encryption, which basically allows the fact that if I'm messaging you, you're messaging me, the government can't read it just like they're able to read our text messages and listen to our regular voice calls. They can't hear those calls, they can't read those messages. So there's an attack on that privacy and that privacy of communication that's taking place. So when you look at the shape and form that the regulations are taking shape right now, and going back to what Shaurya said in the beginning about the fact that they should respect fundamental rights, unfortunately, we don't really see a protection of fundamental rights coming through in these rules and potentially in the laws that are coming up. We haven't seen the final version of the Digital India Act, but I think above all, we need to protect safe harbor. The internet, we haven't seen any version of the Digital India Act, but we have seen presentations from the minister at those consultations that he has thankfully held, and that has a line, do we even need safe harbor? I think the internet in this country, Digital India, cannot survive without safe harbor protections for intermediaries, period.
Right. I think we'll come back to that point, and I think I also want to look at classification of intermediaries, so maybe, Nikhil, I'll come back to you on that, but Mr. Doval, I want to come back to you. I think you feel free to respond to what fellow panelists have also said, but one thing which we've been looking at and the minister has been talking about is making internet more open, more trusted, more accountable, and more safe. Right. Now, in your understanding and your opinions, you've identified some of the challenges which we discussed around proliferation of fake news and problematic content. And a lot of those also happened, through informed campaigns. Right. Now, what is it that the Indian lawmaking machinery, the law enforcement, and the tech ecosystem, both working in India and within the government and the private sector, can do to make the internet more safer when it comes to safety, right? And we've been looking at various laws across the world where there's a lot more impetus and focus on making internet safer. Do you feel that stronger laws are the answer, or do you feel that there are collaborations which can be delivered upon, which can make internet a safer place, and responsibilities lie across multiple institutions, and it's not just the government's job, but also the intermediaries, the communities, and I think a lot of focus also should be on rehabilitation, etc. So what's your take on that?
So I'll take to some of the comments the co-panelists have said. I think I understand the concerns that you all have shared. And I think it's, we have to go back to, I think, the constitution that we started off with. That is the framework under which we all as citizens of India live, and under which all the institutions of the Indian system work, including the state. Now we are in an environment where we've been hit by a technological tsunami, where we really don't know how this thing is actually evolving and is affecting our daily lives in the ways that is both unprecedented in its scale and its speed. And I think the system as a whole is reacting to it and trying to come up with this set of norms under which it will be governed. And that's just not an India problem, but it's a global problem. And India, of course, will have to devise its own unique responses, but a response system has to be developed. What I think we are seeing is a evolution of a response system. This will be an iterative process. There will be times when the response will be less than what is required, in which case it will have to be augmented, things like in crime, in areas. And sometimes it may be over-excessive, where it may be the control of the state, impingement of privacy rights, where it will then have to be retracted back to a level where where it will be acceptable and will be within the framework of the constitution. And I think India is just about embarking on this process. We're actually a bit late. 23 years have lapsed since nothing was being done about this, and what were we doing thinking? I think it's a very, very good start that at least we are now responding to that situation. I completely agree with you that one single act cannot solve for a development that is so all-consuming in our lives. You know, if it was just one specific area like in the past, maybe it was easier. So I think this act should probably be the basis around which a lot more acts will have to come, a lot more mechanisms will have to come. And to the question that you asked, that all of these will not just be the responsibility of the state. It will also be the responsibility of the citizenry. For example, the protection of the Indian state is just not the sole responsibility of the government of India. Yes, it is its prime responsibility, but it is also the responsibility of every citizen of the country. If a country collapses, you know, and we see countries collapsing, the citizens are also equally victims of it. So how do you build a societal, a government response to this? Sometimes it will require, limitation of individual rights and privileges. Even our constitution does that. Even our constitution puts limits on our individual rights for the betterment of the larger collective good. So my sense is that India is a very dynamic society. India is a democratic polity where there are constant institutions in constant dialogue with each other, the judiciary, the media, the civil society, the state. And I think through this process of evolution, we will definitely learn from everywhere in the world, but we must come up with our own unique model, which is, as I said in the beginning, appropriate and is dynamic enough to be evolutionary. Because one thing we know in this thing is that we are dealing with a beast that is not that is very, very rapidly changing in its form. So I think that will be the challenge of our policy makers and our state institutions and our society to be able to respond to that.
So what we need is a nimble law, we need an agile law, and Apar, feel free to respond to some of the comments as well, but a couple of questions to you as well, sort of taking forward. One is on intersectoral harmonization, right? I mean, this is going to be a law which will regulate multiple services, while we have other laws which are being framed. You have a digital protection bill, you have a proposed to be maybe a digital competition act which will regulate digital markets specifically. You are looking at a new telecom bill, right? So there are multiple bills coming in which are focusing on technology sector, and then there are rules by various ministries, etc. So one on that, on regulation of harmonization of laws, but also around, just we spoke about transparency before, and if you want to sort of bring in or talk about the blocking process, or is there a reform required in terms of just the takedown process which happens in India? I think alluding to what Mr. Doval was talking about is we have to find a right balance. So what is that balance between safety on one hand, but the reasonable restrictions being reasonable enough?
Kazim, I'm really sorry that I'm not getting into the specificity of my views on safe harbor or blocking, but much of it has been written and it's been published by the Indian Express Group, by Financial Express, and I would encourage more people to look at it. I've been writing on these issues and problem of transparency for a long period of time, and I believe transparency is the first step of a three-stage process. Transparency should lead to accountability, and accountability should then lead to redress, remedy, and social justice. So these are the 3 points conceptually how I think about it. I'm using this forum rather, given the kind of people who are attending it, to propose some thoughts, spark some conversations in terms of what is possible and what we already have in terms of our institutional frameworks and remains underutilized. It reminds me of 2 recent books I've read. One is by Naushad Forbes and the other one is by Kelkar and Ajay Shah. And both are on public policy, and they fit to, and they point out that even when we pass laws, what we suffer from, firstly, is low state capacity. And the second is we underinvest in our institutional frameworks by itself. I would particularly recommend Naushad's book because it's putting this point across very, very clearly. Now, the prescription which follows from that is when you're making a policy framework, you want it to be based on each sector when the range of your transformation is so wide. How can that be achieved? If you look at the Information Technology Act, even at that point in time, in 1998, when it was being mooted by an interministerial committee, 1999, when an ordinance was passed, it had what was called as a Cyber Regulations Advisory Committee. It had a multi-stakeholder group, which is statutorily provided. It was never established, and this is across governments. It was never actualized, and which is why you did not have a constant team of cross-sector experts bringing diverse views and building capacity within the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. I wrote to them. I asked them to also operationalize it. And I also write quite often saying why the financial outlay, this is point number 2, in the union budget needs to be increased for the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. They need more money. It has always been seen as an orphan ministry which was initially headed and centered around the Ministry of Communications by itself, then as a department, and finally as a ministry. Now, if it's a ministry and in this union budget, it has got more allocation, shouldn't it be given the amount of money to hire the kind of talent to grow its capacity and have the ability of actually piloting these policy interventions? The third idea I would like to put here, and I am at fault because I steal from everyone, I steal from France here. It has an advisory body, somewhat like our Planning Commission Niti Aayog, but it only focuses on technology. And it gives recommendations to each government ministry. For instance, if the Ministry of Health wants to launch a whole set of technologies, where will it draw its policy expertise rather than just outsourcing and deciding it within the ministry? Secondly, if the Ministry of Agriculture wants to launch something which relates to agri-stack, if it's education and there's India, so each sector by itself really benefits from recommendations which are made continuously to it. And this kind of body actually composes of experts from civil society as well as from industry. So I think what we are facing today can be mitigated with, to a large extent, by building the right kind of policy frameworks and drawing in people into government and government benefiting from those kind of institutional systems. It needs to happen over a period of time. It won't happen suddenly. It wouldn't happen with one law.
Thanks, Apar. Very important principles over there. So good to hear.
I have
that.
not answered any of your questions.
Yeah, I'll take you on that. Really? We may have a private discussion afterwards. But Nikhil, I want to come to you, and a lot of discussion has happened around principles, constitutional rights, safety, security, speech. I want to sort of look at startups, and this is an area where you've been doing a lot of work. And of course, the buzzword this year, which is AI. Everybody is looking at generative AI, and it's the flavor of the town. So number one, if we've seen historically, regulations have always supported the industrial growth, right? Be in the electricity sector or the telecom sector in the 1990s. Liberal regulations have helped growing the industry. That has been the hallmark. What can the IT Act, the new IT Act needs to do to empower the startups, and what is it that we need from a regulatory standpoint to make their lives easier? And where do you see the regulation of AI as well?
So one of the challenges that we've been seeing in the tech and the startup space over the last couple of years at least is that the ease of doing business has actually reduced substantially. The kind of regulations that have come in, especially if you look at the certain guidelines, the cybersecurity guidelines, pretty much every company is not in compliance with them. So what you have right now is a sword hanging over everybody's head, saying that you could be taken to task if the need arises, if you're not in compliance. Just like, the minister said in the morning that for 2 years, Twitter was not in compliance with the IT rules. But my question is, why didn't you act on it? Effectively, you're passing laws and creating regulations so that you use them when you want to use them. And that's the problem, the fear in the startup ecosystem. I mean, particularly on the cybersecurity guidelines from certain, completely without proper consultation, just thrown at everyone. And then they brought out these FAQs, which they said are not legally binding, which ease things up a little bit. What kind of regulation is that? So I'm a little worried about what we discussed earlier about sectoral regulation as well, because what happens is that, this is the Digital Bharat Summit, right? And when you want more entrepreneurs, more people to start companies from small towns, and we're seeing a lot of action happening in Indore in particular, in the startup space. And if you're going to have very harsh sectoral regulation and if you start creating more and more regulators, the regulators are going to regulate. And so if I'm starting something and I'm trying to find a product market fit, I will maybe start something in, let's say, the health tech space. I'll have to go to a digital health regulator, or I'll have to comply with some digital health guidelines. But maybe my product market fit comes in health insurance or in insurance by itself. I will then need to, there'll be a cost attached to shifting to insurance and then dealing with the IRDA, which is, at least historically in the tech space, has been extremely regressive. So the problem is to quite an extent, the shape shifting that innovators, that founders require to find out what their business should be, because these are all fledgling businesses, they're all trying to move fast and trying to figure things out. And I know many of them end up breaking things, and we need to address those issues. But that ability to find a product market fit and find a business model is going to get hampered if you have very harsh sectoral regulation with very clear divides. Like payments is very difficult to enter the payment space anymore because of the RBI guidelines in payments. Fintech, a lot of fintech companies were just wiped out because the RBI moved to a white labeling mechanism for which fintech startups should be allowed. There were some licenses that Paytm didn't get, for example, right? So you will find it more and more difficult, and the Digital India Act, if it adopts a very hard sectoral approach, you're going to find that your idea of a digital Bharat for more startups, more innovation, more experiments, those are going to get curtailed. And while we do need guardrails to make sure that people don't, that people don't start abusing the freedom that they have as businesses in exploiting consumers, and we've seen some of that happening in fintech, you also need to ensure that you don't have a situation where there is no safe harbor. Because how was safe harbor brought into the IT Act? It's because the founder of an Indian startup called Bazi.com, at that time it had been acquired by eBay, was actually arrested because someone was selling a porn clip on his site, and he came to Delhi to help Delhi police with that investigation, and they arrested him at the airport. Now you're talking about removing that law. The IT rules already provide for criminal liability for an employee of a social media company. And so therefore, the companies have no choice but to comply with everything that the government throws at them, because otherwise someone will go to jail. So it's not, what I'm saying is, we shouldn't create a disabling environment. In case of AI, for example, what we need is an enabling environment for more Indian language LLMs, for more large language models for Indian languages, because right now the API cost of, let's say, from ChatGPT for using Indian languages is, for Hindi, it's about twice the cost of other languages, right? Of English. Some of the regional languages, it can be 10 to 20 times the cost. And so how will you build, AI chatbots, language to text, text to language, text to voice, text to video sort of things for Indian languages, when the cost is going to be prohibitively high? We need, so for example, there's an Indian government organization called TDIL, which has a lot of language data sets and traditional languages. They need to open source their data sets so that more things can be done with that instead of holding it under copyright. So we need much more support from the government from an AI perspective. At the same time, we need guardrails around AI, because these are self-learning models. They can go wrong. They can be misused. They can be, in the US, there was a case where someone basically had put incorrect information from ChatGPT into a lawsuit or something of that sort. So you need to be far more careful with how you build AI tools. But I think above all, right now, we need more support for Indian languages. Because, it would be very easy, for example, for the Financial Express to translate its website into, say, a language like Bodo, maybe 3 or 4 years from now. That opportunity for language is huge right now, but we need better training data sets.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but it's very interesting, because I'd like to just think about this thing that you just mentioned, that I said, I'd just like to build on something you mentioned, because this is the dilemma of the policy planners, I guess. So, one singular achievement of India in the last 8-9 years has been to bring these 500 million people onto this digital platform. This is what pretty much everybody is saying will trigger the next trajectory of India's growth from a $3 trillion to whatever $1 trillion economy in the future. Now, these are real people. You talked about the fintech industry. Absolutely, this industry requires innovation. That's one important aspect of this. So you need those companies out there to be innovating, to be trying new things, to be coming up with new products. And at the second hand, you've got 500 million poor people who have just put in, over the last 6-7 years, $24 billion into these bank accounts. These people never trusted the digital system, but the banking system with their money. Now, what do? One fraud, one disruption, one something will completely shatter their confidence in their system. So you've got to manage that on one side. At the same time, you've got to give an enabling environment to these fintech companies to go out and experiment with their products, and some mistakes will be made. Some will be legitimate. Some will be exploiting of this, the simple ecosystem, for lack of a better word, the simplicity of the people who are putting this money. So how do policy planners actually come up with a model, and then on that you overlay all these new things like, the last hearing about AI, changing the way, being able to replicate your language and, voice, etc. So I guess this is the real challenge of the times of a country, and in a country like India, I guess the problem is compounded by two things. Just the number of people. So if you are a UK, you're dealing with 60 million people. Here you're dealing with 1.3 billion people. You're as I said, 850 million people on. So how do you deal with this stuff?
It's a longer conversation, but I think we had an example, right? The microfinance industry, especially in Hyderabad, in Andhra at that time. In 2003, 4, 5 and what happened there, you could have put in guardrails in the fintech industry over here to make sure that doesn't get repeated. So high NPAs, exploitative behavior. We never learned our lessons. That's the problem. So it could have been prevented. But yes, there is a challenge of enabling innovation and protecting people. But I'm saying also, and that's a tightrope to walk. It's not an easy challenge. Therefore, what you need is more consultations. What you're also seeing is a lot of regulation happen by just being without the consultations. That's why the certain rules last year were just terrible. Even with these Digital India Act consultations that have taken place, I mean, there are people who've had to try and get their way in because for those public consultations, the access wasn't easily available. And so, do you really want a consultation? In the IT rules, Apar will remember, when there was a substantial consultation, 600 pages of comments were submitted. Almost none of those recommendations made it to the, of issues that might arise, made it to the final rules, IT rules that came out, which are actually violative of Indian law. And they're being challenged in court on those grounds. Let's start with not making illegal rules. Let's not disrespect Parliament in that sense and go through the proper parliamentary processes. I mean, you can't use a safe harbor provision to say platforms need to break end-to-end encryption. Right. We also would prefer a government that doesn't go to Parliament and says there's no fundamental right to privacy, but that's a different debate altogether. Respecting fundamental rights is important as well.
Apar, you want to respond, and then we'll just open the floor for the question.
No. More towards the audience there.
Okay. Great. So I think we are over time. I think we are out of time. I would prefer maybe if female participants could start with a couple of questions, because we haven't heard from them, but maybe we can have some hand raised over there. Yes, and a couple of hands over there as well. So maybe if you can just pass the mic.
Hello. Thank you so much for this insightful discussion. I just had one quick question. With respect to, like, we've been seeing that the government is talking that new forms of harms have come, and some communities like women, LGBTQ plus groups, disabled people are disproportionately being impacted by these harms and the online challenges. And the government has been talking about there'll be some frameworks around tackling doxing, catfishing, and other forms of harms. But how do you think, in actual scenario, these harms can be tackled better? You think we have the capacity that just a Digital India law is going to come in and it's going to solve these challenges? is there need for greater involvement of other stakeholders like the community, the law enforcement agencies, and adequate sensitization about the aspects and the different kinds of sensitivities that's involved in tackling these harms, not just in terms of like creating a law and ensuring that there is penalties, but also ensuring that there is enforcement and there is appropriate remediation so that there is an appropriate amount of deterrence created in the society. So how all these aspects can be considered. Thank you.
Who wants to take that? I think that's on tech-based, gender-based.
I think when you talk about these different groups, the legal approaches are one thing which is certainly something which can be implemented. But I think what's also useful is to introspect and look at what the state can do little much more proactively. Make all government websites access-friendly for people who are disabled. COVIN was not when it was launched. It wasn't even in multiple languages. Didn't have a privacy policy. So I think if I would be a person who's saying that, hey, all of my citizens need to do something, I would first start by doing it myself. The second, and of course that's a state capacity problem. The second is that we notice that all of these different harms which are being articulated are being pushed towards a carceral framework. What I mean by carceral is that let's file a FIR and let's commence a criminal investigation. The increasing criminalization of vast ranges of human activity which are undesirable, and I agree are undesirable, are still human activity. They may not by themselves be criminal. And one such thing is catfishing, right? And catfishing is basically, I would say, done by everyone here in some way or form. You're exaggerating your online persona in order to attract attention, sometimes romantically, sometimes without any sense of romance. But everyone has an online persona. That is at the root of catfishing by itself. When does catfishing become a harm? When it is not catfishing? When it is having a second order effect in terms of a financial injury which is suffered by somebody else. For instance, the calls people have received on WhatsApp asking for their personal details through which they are then swindled or they are extorted with respect to any kind of money. So I would say we have a large body of laws. The Indian Penal Code by itself flows into more than 500 sections. It does apply to all forms of online activity. The Digital India Act does not need to reflect a carceral vision of Indian society, does not need to criminalize everything, each and everything, for it may lead to situations where we may not have a 66A, but we may have a B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Okay, so that would be my approach, but that's only a small part of the question. Shruti, I think the larger question is that what is the intention of the law, how should we regulate? And I think there the conversation needs to be a code, it needs to be an interministerial committee, it needs to be much more broad-based, and it should start with a vision which is articulated, which comes from our constitution. Now, if you look at the Europeans, and they have done it well, we don't share their values, we don't share the European values, we have our own values. But they said we had the anti-competition law, and we have a data protection law, and they similarly do not like big tech platforms. They said, this is our vision, that in terms of the types of social harm, we are going to encourage greater data sharing within government and digitize our governance processes. We are going to check gatekeeper harms which are there. And these are the different kinds of laws we are going to come up with, and we are going to pilot through the calendar of the next 4 years. Can we have a timetable? Can we have an articulated vision of what we have? What does it cater to? What does it miss? And what do we want? And I think that would be a great starting point.
Great. I think we have a couple of more questions we can take up. So, gentleman over there, I think, has his hand raised. Maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Sir, thank you very much. I am Dr. Sangwan. I am from the field of biology and agriculture. Problem, I will leave it now that the fence is eating the field. Because we are helpless people, particularly the farmers, we do not get hurt anywhere. And we only produce everything for survival. Second thing, that every citizen in India has a right in every policy framework. Under the Constitution, Article 243 ZE and Article 243 ZD. Which is not applicable in India till date. So how the policy, you are making policy for me, for farmer. and you have never been to the field. You don't know how the crops are grown and who grows it and what are their problems. And that feedback is the raw material for policy. And that's the framework will be right and for the benefit of the people who are the stakeholder. Thank you very much.
Fair enough. I think it's talking about farmers and maybe different communities. And
There's a very good book. It's out of print. It's called Grass Without Roots. Okay, and it is on how policy development did take place in the Planning Commission and why it was not able to deliver the kind of results it promised. But you put a challenge. You also said one policy framework which has worked. Why are we all sitting here and having access to this kind of hospitality here would have been unimaginable in 1991 when we liberalized our economy and we have enjoyed growth rates which have uplifted a lot of people out of poverty. I agree with your point that policy formation frameworks are largely not consultative, do not involve a large number of people. But we cannot be also cynical and say that because there's an absence of perfection, everything is broken. Okay, so I do think that there's a need for us to moderate both our cynicism and optimism to have a much more pragmatic basis of what has been possible and what we have achieved in this country.
yeah, I think well said, Apar, and I think we are out of time, so if I don't think we'll be able to take any further questions, but thank you all so much for joining in. Thank you, Mr. Doval, thank you, Apar, Nikhil, for joining in, and thank you to Financial Express Group for doing this. And yeah, look forward to more such discussions. And
Thank you, Kazim.
Yeah, hopefully we can, next time we talk, we'll have a bill in public domain, a Digital India bill, and then maybe Financial Express can reconvene all of us again and we can have a good discussion on that as well. But thank you all, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our panelists. That was indeed a thought-provoking session.